What was original about Locke's thoughts concerning education?
Locke originally wrote down his ideas in answer to his relative Edward Clarke, who asked how he should raise his son to grow up to be a gentleman. There was broad interest in this subject among a new group of property owners, who had representation in their government and were neither poor nor idly rich. Locke's letters to Clarke were first published anonymously in 1693, and then became Some Thoughts Concerning Education, which went through 24 editions by 1800, 5 of which Locke supervised before he died. Locke advised that the temperament of the child should be observed so that, having once established your authority and the ascendant over him, the next thing must be to bend the crooks the other way if he have any in him. But he counseled a light touch concerning physical discipline, which was an innovation. And he suggested that shame was a better tool than corporeal punishment. Locke's system for bringing up male children to become men of property and affairs involved an austere diet, trained bowels, hard beds, early rising, and plenty of exercise outdoors with bare heads and wet feet in all kinds of weather. The fondness of mothers and superstitions of servants were to be minimized. Locke assumed that self-discipline in childhood would result in strong adults. Locke thought children should be educated at home, by sober tutors, with an emphasis on learning languages. He had no use for poetry or abstract, speculative learning, but advised that astronomy, geography, anatomy, history, and geometry be part of the home curriculum. He also advised that a gentleman's son acquire skill in at least one manual trade, such as painting, woodworking, gardening, or metalworking.
What was the reaction to the meditations?
Catholic theologians found René Descartes' doubt in the existence of God too convincing to be resolved by his ontological argument. Others were left with a division of the world into two radically different substances of mind and matter, a dualism very difficult to resolve. Mind could be directly introspected, but it eluded science. Matter, by which Descartes meant insensible particles that had only size, shape, quantity, and mass, primary qualities, was the ultimate subject of science. Descartes believed that we know less about matter than mind. The question was, how are mind and matter connected? Descartes' ideas of substance, his dualism, and the mind-body problem preoccupied his contemporaries and successors. Benedict de Spinoza, 1632–1677, reacted with a dual aspect theory of God and nature. Nicolas Malebranche, 1638–1715, tried to answer the question of how mind and matter were connected with his theory of occasionalism. Gottfried Leibniz, 1646–1716, also had a version of occasionalism in his theory of pre-established harmony. On the empiricist side, Thomas Hobbes, 1588 to 1679, insisted on the non-existence of anything non-material, and John Locke, 1632 to 1704, directly attacked Descartes' idea of substance. Descartes thought that substance was what held matter together and what held mind together. Even though substance could not be experienced directly. According to Descartes, all physical things were material substance and all mental things immaterial substance.
What was alchemy?
The Latin motto of alchemy was Solve et coagula, which means separate and combine. Alchemy was practiced throughout the Christian, Islamic, and Jewish world until the 19th century and beyond. Traditionally, the central project of practicing alchemists was to discover how to turn base metals into gold. Second to this was a search for the elixir of life, which would cure all sickness and enable immortality. Medieval alchemists sought a philosopher's stone, which they believed would make both tasks possible. And they also worked on formulas for a universal solvent or aqua vitae. One form of aqua vitae has endured as a concentrated ethanol liquid, ethyl alcohol.
Who was Richard Rorty?
Richard Mackay Rorty, 1931 to 2007, was probably the most widely read contemporary American philosopher who is not considered to be doing philosophy by analytic and empirical philosophers. He taught at Wellesley, Princeton, the University of Virginia, and Stanford. Rorty began as an analytic philosopher, arguing in favor of eliminative materialism. But with Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature, 1979, he began in the late 1970s to criticize analytic philosophy from a pragmatic perspective that drew on continental thought. As a neo-pragmatist, Rorty believed that most philosophical problems are illusions caused by language. That truth is a somewhat arbitrary and relative ideal, and that philosophy is just a literary genre. His main writings include Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature, Consequences of Pragmatism, 1982. Philosophy in History, 1985, Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity, 1989, Objectivity, Relativism and Truth. Philosophical Papers I, 1991, Essays on Heidegger and Others, Philosophical Papers II. 1991, Achieving Our Country, Leftist Thought in 20th Century America, 1998. Truth and Progress, Philosophical Papers 3, 1998, Philosophy and Social Hope, 2000, Against Bosses. Against Oligarchies, A Conversation with Richard Rorty, 2002, The Future of Religion with Johnny Vadimo. 2005, and Philosophy as Cultural Politics, Philosophical Papers 4, 2007.
What did Martin Heidegger mean by ontology?
The term ontology refers to the study of being in a general sense that is relevant to all thinkers and theorists. Empiricists, for example, have ontologies in that there are some entities that they believe exist. According to Heidegger, ontology, as the first and last subject of philosophy, is the study of being, with a capital B. Being is existence itself, including everything that exists. But in particular human consciousness, for which being is first and foremost the condition of its own being. For readers who find this confusing, excellent relaxation can be found in Günter Grass' 1963 novel Dog Years, which contains a parody of Heidegger's terminology. In the literal description of a canine's wanderings during the Nazi era. For the more scholarly inclined, there is Theodor Adorno's The Jargon of Authenticity, 1973.
Who was Jean Baudrillard?
Jean Baudrillard, 1929, is a social theorist who writes about the absence of the kind of educated public discourse described by Jürgen Habermas, 1929, in pessimistic but elegant and evocative prose. He is, like Richard Rorty, 1931–2007, a very readable postmodernist, but less sanguine. Baudrillard's thought on terrorism in the Shadow of the Silent Majority, 1982, and The Spirit of Terrorism, and Requiem for the Twin Towers, 2002, identifies it as a media manipulating appropriation of public attention in a culture where only the spectacle is taken seriously. This is not a frivolous view insofar as it is based on a thoroughgoing analysis of contemporary life as in large part virtual, made up of simulacra of previous forms of human existence. An example of this would be the way that newly constructed old towns are simulacra of historical places. And American pizza is a simulacrum of Italian food. This is apparently not just a question of things lacking authenticity, according to Baudrillard, but of a mass preference for virtuality instead of reality. Thus in The Gulf War Did Not Take Place, 1991, he describes how experiences of the First Gulf War, even and especially for the troops, were mediated by its representation on television, radio, and other media forms. According to externally determined scripts that only captured bits and pieces of the actual experience.
How were Locke's ideas about substance related to his theory of knowledge?
Locke confined knowledge to sensory information and the workings of the mind. And he had a moderate skepticism about claims beyond those two sources of information. Locke introduced his essay concerning human understanding, 1689, as the result of conversations among friends which led to the question of what it was possible for them to know. Given the limitations of human faculties, it was necessary to examine our own abilities and see what objects our understandings were or were not fitted to deal with. Locke's method was not to rely on tradition or what other philosophers had claimed, but to look to the things themselves. Knowledge, according to Locke, was direct awareness of some fact. The only facts we can know are those that consist of relationships among our ideas. A fact is something true about the world. Locke did not think that we had direct experience of the world. Things in the world acted on our sense organs to produce ideas. Therefore, the truths we know, facts, are about the relationships between ideas. Ideas are mental objects for Locke, some of which are representations of things in the world. In Book I of the essay, Locke attacks the rationalist doctrine of innate ideas and innate knowledge. His argument is that we have innate capacities, but nothing like knowledge until there is experience. This is Locke's famous description of the mind as a tabula rasa, or blank slate. In Book 2, he explains our different types of ideas by tracing them to sensation and reflection on sensation. Reflection consists of combination, division, generalization, and abstraction. For Locke, our ideas are like impressions from experience. When we consider our ideas in our minds, we can combine different ideas, divide an idea into more ideas, generalize about what ideas in a group share, or abstract some property shared by a group of ideas. In Book 3, Locke explains how words can mislead us about facts or the things themselves. Book 4 is a discussion of how we are obligated to conduct our minds in forming beliefs, so as not to stray too far from what we know.
Was Boethius guilty or innocent of plotting against Theodoric the Great?
Boethius, 480 c. 525, was arrested for suspicion of treason after his correspondence with Constantinople was disclosed. He had been very critical of Theodoric during his first year as Master of Offices under Theodoric the Great. 454 to 526, and this resulted in several enemies. They convinced Theodoric, based on his theological writings that seemed to support the Eastern Church, that Boethius sympathized with Justinian, who ruled in the remains of the Roman Empire in the East and aspired to reunite the empire. The Church had split into two churches in 318 over the tenets of Arianism, which denied the Trinity. Boethius' executioners beat him to death after tightening a cord around his neck, which caused his eyes to pop out of his head. Theodoric later regretted this cruel death sentence, but soon after his arrest, Boethius had said, "Had there been any hopes of liberty, I should have freely indulged them. Had I known of a conspiracy against the king, you would not have known of it from me."
Who were the Philosophes?
The term philosophy can and has been applied to virtually all intellectuals who advocated change in the world order during the decades leading up to the American and French revolutions. In that sense, David Hume, Jeremy Bentham, and Benjamin Franklin were all philosophs. However, to tell a manageable history of philosophy, it is useful to narrow the term down to the French encyclopedists and Adam Smith, Edward Gibbon, Gotthold Lessing, and Cesare Beccaria.
What was Spinoza's philosophical system?
Although Spinoza's system had very strong theological elements and he was motivated to construct it for the ethical purpose of determining how to live, he did not base morality on God, but rather on adequate human knowledge. Such knowledge would enable both an ability to control the passions and live peacefully with others. However, indirectly, this knowledge of nature amounted to knowledge of God because, according to Spinoza, God was present throughout nature. Spinoza wrote philosophy in the form of geometrical proofs, and began with axioms from which he proved his conclusions. First, he made the assumption that substance exists. Substance, he continued, has infinite attributes. But humans can perceive only two of these, extension and thought, or matter and mind. Spinoza's metaphysics was a monism. Only one thing existed, and that was God. God, according to Spinoza, was a being absolutely infinite. Although God had infinite attributes, each one of which expressed his nature without limitation to itself, humans can perceive or understand only two of God's infinite attributes: thought and material bodies, or extension. Each attribute has both infinite modes and finite modes, although finite modes are infinite in number. A person, for example, is one finite mode of God. Existing in God as both a mode of thought and a mode of extension. One way of understanding Spinoza is that mind and matter are different ways of viewing the same thing that exists in God. As everything that exists, God is nature, but nature is also God. Spinoza distinguished between natura naturans, or God in his active role as creating, and natural naturita, or what we humans perceive as nature.
Who were some important women philosophers from antiquity?
Although they probably are but the tip of an iceberg: Themistocles, Theano of Crotona, Diotima of Mantinea, Aspasia of Miletus, Isara of Lucania, Fintus of Sparta, Perictian I, Theano II, Hypatia of Alexandria, Aspigenia of Athens, and Arete of Cyrene deserve specific mention.
What is truth functional logic?
Truth-functional logic preserves logical truth by substituting terms according to the rules of logic. The truth or falsity of a statement can be calculated according to the truth of its parts. For example, if A or not A, the law of non-contradiction, is a rule. Then if A is true, not A must be false, if A is false, then not A must be true. Compound sentences are true or false depending only on whether their components are true or false. For example, the sentence "it is raining and cold" is true if "it is raining" is true and "it is cold" is true. Truth-functional logic is typically applied according to tables that indicate the truth values of sentences that contain clauses linked by the connectives if, and, not, if then, and if and only if. The truth or falsity of the whole sentence depends on the truth or falsity of its components. According to the rules of logic that apply to each of the connectives.
Why did Sokal do this?
He explained it this way: I'm an unabashed old leftist who never quite understood how deconstruction was supposed to help the working class. And I'm a stodgy old scientist who believes, naively, that there exists an external world. That there exist objective truths about that world, and that my job is to discover some of them. In other words, besides thinking that, and showing how postmodern thought was of poor intellectual and scholarly quality, Sokal did not believe it served a worthy political purpose. Sokal, along with Jean Bricmont, a physicist professor and philosopher of science, further developed the critique implied by Sokal's article in their book Fashionable Nonsense, 1997.
What were Herbert Spencer's ideas about evolution?
Spencer believed that change occurs according to the law of evolution, which dictates a progression from simplicity to homogeneity to uniformity to more complexity to heterogeneity to variety. At any stage, all of the parts that are changing are also part of one whole. Spencer cited as evidence examples from the physical, biological, psychological, and social sciences. Society itself evolves from primitive homogeneous forms to complex advanced ones. He pointed out, whereby component parts have different functions. Because Spencer thought that change follows its own internal rules. He believed that social progress cannot be the result of external actions, such as social welfare or the regulation of trade. In education, he believed that children should be taught skills that would best enable them to compete with others. Spencer's views were taken up by social Darwinists, who advocated the principles of the survival of the fittest for society. Against social reform generally, and in favor of capitalistic competition, specifically.
How is Confucianism relevant to contemporary Western philosophy?
Confucianism is conservative and does not appear to be based on individual autonomy or self-rule. Its highest moral principle seems to be social conformity. To this extent it is not easily imported into Western moral, political, and social philosophy. However, a number of contemporary moral philosophers have found some appeal in the Confucian egalitarian ideal of respect for all beings. Confucianism has also been received as an alternative virtue ethics theory, as well as for its utilitarian/consequentialist notion that correct behavior will maximize happiness. Such comparative ideas, as well as contemporary interpretations and applications of Confucianism, can be found in the following sources: Bo Mao, Comparative Approaches to Chinese Philosophy, 2003. Lishang Lisa Rosenli, Confucianism and Women, A Philosophical Interpretation, 2006, Philip J. Ivanhoe, Ethics in the Confucian Tradition, The Thought of Menzi and Wang Yangming, 2002, Brian W. Van Norden, Confucius and the Analects, New Essays, 2002, and Kwang-Loi Shun and David B. Wang, Confucian Ethics, A Comparative Study of Self, Autonomy and Community, 2004.
What were Alcmaeon's innovations in medicine?
Alcmaeon, c. 500 BCE provided new answers to the question, what is health? He explained health as isonomia, or physical equilibrium. This equilibrium was a balance of opposites, which can't be restored indefinitely. Therefore, all living things die.
Who was Benedict de Spinoza?
Benedict, Baruch, de Spinoza, 1632–1677, stands out as a loner among 17th-century thinkers. He was excommunicated from the Jewish community in Amsterdam for his unorthodox ideas. After that, he had few contacts with other Jews. But because he was a Jew, his Dutch acquaintances were not friendly to him. In 1660, he moved from Amsterdam to Ravensburg and then to Voorburg. In 1663, he wrote about Descartes' philosophy in Renati Descartes Principiorum Philosophiae, Pars Iet 2. His Tractatus Theologico-Politicus was published anonymously in 1670. He was then offered the chair of philosophy at Heidelberg University, in 1673. But he turned it down because he did not want to jeopardize his peace of mind. He thought that academics were constantly arguing among themselves and engaging in petty disputes and grudges. He knew Gottfried Leibniz, 1646–1716, and corresponded with the Royal Society members Henry Oldenburg and Christian Huygens. Spinoza's Ethics, 1677, was published after his death, as was his Tractatus de Intellectus Emendatione, 1677. That Spinoza preferred to think on his own, with little outside influence, made his work very distinctive. But it also was part of the reason for a prolonged lack of recognition of him as a philosopher.
Who was Mikhail Bakunin?
Mikhail Bakunin, 1814 to 1876, was a Russian anarchist and revolutionary who was active in Europe from 1840 to 1849 and 1861 to 1871. During the years between these periods, he was imprisoned in both Europe and Russia, and for a time was exiled to Siberia. His views are held to be contradictory because he believed both that the instinct for freedom in the masses would lead to revolution and that revolution would need to be the result of a plan by educated elite. In his first period, Bakunin criticized liberal projects to reconcile the demands of workers with the establishment. And he was particularly excoriating about both the church and the state. In his second period, he attacked scientism, or the dominance of technical approaches to public policy, calling for a revolt of life against science. Overall, Bakunin and his followers were opposed to the development of Marxism.
What was Vico's cyclical idea of history?
Vico believed that there are cultural patterns that dominate in different societies. Thus, law, religion, politics, art, and manners all tend to match up at any given time and place. For example, he drew connections between Athenian law and its pre-Socratic and Socratic philosophies. In his cyclical account of history, or what he called corsi e ricorsi, societies organically develop and then age and rot. He posited a bestial condition, a time of the gods, and a time of heroes, which also leads to oligarchies, or rule by the richest. This is followed by an age of men, characterized by class conflict, until the society decays. Vico applied this theory to the history of Rome, beginning with the mythical founders Romulus and Remus and ending with its overthrow by external barbarians.
What was Arthur Schopenhauer's moral system?
Schopenhauer believed that we should harm no one and help others as much as we can, only on the level of appearance. When we are in direct contact with our own individual wills, is this difficult? In the noumenal realm, there is only one will and we are all part of it. So to harm another person is, in effect, to harm ourselves.
Who was Paul Feyerabend?
Paul Feyerabend, 1924 to 1994, who was a friend and colleague of Imre Lakatos. 1922 to 1974, is famous for his anarchist view of science. He was born in Vienna, Austria, and served in the German army during World War II. Sustaining a bullet to the spine. After the war, he studied at the London School of Economics, with Karl Popper, 1902 to 1994, as his advisor. During this time he began a dialogue with Lakatos, taking a stand against Lakatos' rationalist scientific project. But publication of this joint work was curtailed by Lakatos' death. Feyerabend had a lifelong interest in theater and opera and taught at the University of California at Berkeley after 1958. Feyerabend's main writings include Against Method, Outline of an Anarchistic Theory of Knowledge, 1975, Science in a Free Society, 1978, Realism, Rationalism and Scientific Method, Philosophical Papers, Volume 1, 1981, Problems of Empiricism. Philosophical Papers, Volume 2, 1981, and the recklessly titled Farewell to Reason, 1987. His autobiography is Killing Time, the autobiography of Paul Feyerabend, 1995.
What is ethical subjectivism?
Ethical subjectivism is either the same as ethical emotivism, or the view that ethical judgments express our shared emotions. Or else it refers to an individual's private moral views as the meaning of morality. So that in principle there could be as many moral systems as there are individuals.
What was Plotinus' association with demonology?
In his biography of Plotinus, 205 to 270, Porphyry, 233 to 309, wrote the following. An Egyptian priest came to Rome once and made acquaintance with Plotinus through a friend. The priest wanted to test his powers and suggested Plotinus to make the daimon that was born with him visible by conjuring. Plotinus gave a ready assent and conjuration took place in the temple of Isis. Because it was, as it is told, the only pure place the Egyptian could find in Rome. When the daimon was conjured to reveal itself, a god appeared who was not one of the daimons. And the Egyptian is said to have called out, "Blessed are you." Because a god is by you as your daimon and not some low-class daimon. But there was no opportunity to ask anything from the apparition or look at it longer. Because a friend who was watching and holding birds in his hands to keep the purity of the place squeezed them to death, be it out of envy or vague fear. Scholars have found this passage interesting because it introduces two new elements to ideas about demons in the ancient world. First, that demons could change into benevolent gods or angels. And second, that birds could be used to protect the purity of the soul. Socrates had a daimon who would counsel him in times of stress or alert him to what was important. However, Plotinus' interactions with demons more resembles later ideas of magic and sorcery than simply listening to a voice, as Socrates did.
What are some other notable works by Montaigne?
In addition to his skeptical writings, Montaigne, 1533 to 1592, became famous for the whole of his essays. 1560, literally, attempts, the most substantial of which was his The Apology of Raymond Sebond. The essays here were far-ranging, witty, digressive, and all about him, his tastes, opinions, and large and petty problems. He also wrote about his trip to Germany, Switzerland, and Italy in his journal de Voyage en Italie par la Suisse et l'Allemagne en 1580 et 1581, Travel Journal. Undertaken after he had presented a copy of his essays to the French king. Montaigne was diplomatically active in trying to quell religious antagonism and instrumental in securing Henry of Navarre's ascension to the throne as King Henry IV. He probably would have become a member of Henry's court had illness not intervened.
What is deconstructionism?
Deconstructionism is a method for interpreting texts, the term for written works used by deconstructionists. That is based on the premise that the meaning of texts depends as much on the writers' background, historical conditions, and those of the reader, as it does on what is in the text itself.
Where does the soul fit into Plotinus' system of Platonic entities?
All individual souls form one world soul, which comes after intelligence. Some souls are disembodied, but those that are in bodies have additional accretions. Humans, animals, and plants all have souls that are immortal. Substantial, that is, they are substances, and incorporeal, not physical. Because they are incorruptible, individual souls may be reincarnated in different bodies. The soul emanates or effulgurates from intelligence. Just as intelligence emanates or effulgurates from the One. These emanations from the One and intelligence neither detract from them nor are they willed. The same is true of the emanation of matter from the soul. Although the processes of emanation from the One, intelligence, and the soul are very natural. Plotinus, 205 to 270, sometimes speaks of them as selfish descents to lower states. In emanating from intelligence, the soul is actualizing a desire to rule. And it becomes too attached to its body, which can lead to its deterioration. However, even when it is incarnated, the soul also lives in intelligence.
What are some of Friedrich Nietzsche's important works?
Nietzsche's principal works consist of 10 books, which are universally held to be a major achievement. His most famous works include The Birth of Tragedy, 1872, The Gay Science, 1882. Thus Spoke Zarathustra, released in 4 parts from 1883 to 1885, Beyond Good and Evil. 1886, On the Genealogy of Morals, 1887, and the Antichrist, 1888. Not to be forgotten is Ecce Homo, or Behold the Man, 1888, which he dedicated to Voltaire and in which Nietzsche included his own endearing essay about his own works, Why I Write Such Good Books, 1888.
How did Friedrich Nietzsche's life presage his philosophy?
The great irony is that in life Nietzsche was very unlike his heroes. Either those of the aristocratic past that he so admired, or of the new age of knowledge and courage that he heralded. His life began in a somewhat sheltered way in Prussia. His father, a Lutheran minister and the son of a Lutheran minister, died when he was 4 of what the doctors called softening of the brain. His mother, Franziska, was only 18 when Friedrich was born. She was the daughter of a Lutheran minister. Contrary to Nietzsche's belief that his forebears were Polish noblemen, many of them were butchers. When Nietzsche was 6, his younger brother died, and he, his mother, and his sister moved to Naumburg. Nietzsche grew up in a household consisting of his mother and sister, his paternal grandmother, and 2 unmarried aunts. Biographers have remarked that this all-family environment was detrimental to his psychological health as an adult. They have referred to this environment in trying to make sense of the hostility Nietzsche displayed toward women in some of his writings, such as this from Thus Spoke Zarathustra, 1883 to 1885. When thou goest to woman, take thy whip. At boarding school, Nietzsche suffered from migraines. He was inspired by the poetry of Johann Hölderlin, who had gone insane. So this was not considered a healthy subject by Nietzsche's teachers. Nietzsche studied theology and classical philology at the University of Bonn, but only philology at the University of Leipzig. He served briefly in the army from 1867 to 1868, and was discharged after a chest injury, which was incurred when he landed on the pommel of his saddle while mounting. When he was only 24, his teachers considered him so promising that he was appointed associate professor of classical philology at Basel. Nietzsche moved to Basel, became a Swiss subject, and, in 1869, a full professor. In 1870 he received leave to serve as a medical orderly in the Franco-Prussian War. Returning to Basel with both dysentery and diphtheria, he received his doctorate in 1873 and resigned from his academic position in 1879 for health reasons. After that, he continued to write and to travel for 9 years.
Who was George Berkeley?
George Berkeley, 1685 to 1753, was the founder of modern idealism. Unlike his 17th-century idealist predecessors, such as Nicholas Malebranche, 1638 to 1715, or Gottfried Leibniz, 1647 to 1716, he was not a rationalist. Berkeley was completely comfortable with science and empiricism in general. And he significantly weighs in with the great triumvirate of British empiricists. John Locke, 1632 to 1704, George Berkeley, 1685 to 1783, and David Hume, 1711 to 1776. Berkeley was born in County Kilkenny in Ireland, where he went to Kilkenny College for 4 years. Beginning at age 11. He then went to Trinity College in Dublin and was elected a Fellow there in 1707, holding the position until 1724. His first book, An Essay Towards a New Theory of Vision, was published in 1709, followed by the treatise concerning the principles of human knowledge in 1710. In 1713, he moved to London and published 3 dialogues between Hylas and Philonas, the first of his works to be well received. He was presented to Queen Anne by the renowned essayist and satirist Jonathan Swift. 1667 to 1745, and became friends with the literary elite of that time. In 1713, Berkeley traveled to Sicily as chaplain to the ambassador. His next position was as a tutor to St. George Ashe, the Bishop of Derry, which involved further travel in Europe. He then wrote De Motu, on motion, in 1721, as well as an essay towards preventing the ruin of Great Britain, in which he argued that a recent financial crisis, the South Sea Island bubble, which was a stock market crash that resulted from over-speculation, was the result of a decline in religion and morals. In 1723 he received a windfall inheritance from Esther van Humrij, an Irish woman of Dutch descent who was a longtime correspondent and lover of Jonathan Swift, who called her Vanessa in his poetry. Berkeley claimed that she was a perfect stranger. In 1724 Berkeley was appointed Dean of Derry, which provided him financial security. But his dream was to found a Christian college in Bermuda that would admit Negroes and Indians, as well as white Americans. He raised money for the project, but not enough for it to become a reality. The British Parliament awarded him £20,000, but that money never came through. Berkeley married in 1728 and he and his wife, Anne, went to Rhode Island to set up farms to grow food for the prospective college. They remained there for 3 years, and then returned to live in London. He defended Christianity in the Minute Philosopher in 1732, and claimed that mathematics was more mysterious than religion in the Analyst in 1734. That same year, he became Bishop of Cloyne, which led him to move back to Ireland, where he remained until he died in 1753, while visiting his son at Oxford University.
What was disturbing about David Hume's analysis of causation?
Hume attacked the scientific and common sense idea that there was a necessary connection between cause and effect. He argued that no matter how closely we observe one billiard ball striking another, there is nothing in the action of the first ball that makes the response of the second inevitable. Only through experience do we learn relationships of cause and effect. To say that an event of type A causes an event of type B is to say no more than that. In the past, events of type A have always been followed by events of type B. This is Hume's constant conjunction theory of causation. The mind relates causes to effects, and vice versa, based on past experience alone, which produces an association of the ideas of causes and effects with each other. For example, the idea of bread is associated with the idea of nourishment.
What was the mission of the Vienna Circle?
The aim of the group was to restate ideas about both scientific knowledge and philosophy, and establish a form of philosophy that would be close to science, unlike German idealism. The members did not think that philosophy had a positive content of its own, or even a distinct epistemology or theory of knowledge. Rather, philosophy should study the knowledge methods and claims of science and justify them. For example, they thought that Albert Einstein's theory of relativity had shown that philosophers could not have the last word on either space or time, as Kantians believed. Arithmetic was believed to be reducible to logic, and synthetic a priori knowledge. Rational knowledge derived from thought alone that was true to experience, was unnecessary. The principle of verification, or verificationism, was their main tenet. Whatever claims to knowledge could not be verified in the sciences was simply not knowledge. The manifesto of the Circle was Wissenschaftliche Weltauffassung, der Wiener Kreis. The scientific conception of the world, the Vienna Circle, was published in 1929 and translated by Otto Neurath, 1882–1945, in his Empiricism and Sociology, 1973. The manifesto proclaims that the scientific world conception of the Vienna Circle is distinguished essentially by two features. First, it is empiricist and positivist. There is knowledge only from experience. Second, the scientific world conception is marked by the application of a certain method, namely logical analysis. Logical analysis is a way of using symbolic logic to determine whether sentences or their components refer to experience. Many logical positivists were also phenomenalists.
What is analytic ethics?
Analytic ethics is the application of both or either. Logical positivism and ordinary language analysis to ethics.
Is there or has there been an African philosophy?
There is a millennially long tradition of oral African philosophy, as well as many active 20th century African philosophers. Once this thought is presented in established Western philosophical terms, however, it does not so much support Afrocentrism as a perspective of racial uplift as it evinces a philosophy by asking questions about its own philosophical enterprise. That is, a great deal of contemporary African philosophy is itself concerned with the question of whether it is philosophy and what that means in an African, although not Afrocentrist, context. The context is not Afrocentrist because Africans who remained in Africa and were not brought to Europe or the Americas had no need for the distinctive uplift of Afrocentrism. Instead, the focus on Africa from an African perspective turns on the question of what the multiplicity of countries and cultures in Africa, each with distinct languages and traditions, have in common so that they can view themselves as African. They share a colonized past and poverty in the present world. They have been designated by biological race, though this is an illusion. Contemporary philosophical sources for African philosophy include Kwame Anthony Appiah. In My Father's House, Africa in the Philosophy of Culture, 1992, Kwame Gyke, Tradition and Modernity. 1997, Emmanuelise, editor, Post-Colonial African Philosophy, 1970, Paulin J. Hauntanji, African Philosophy, Myth and Reality, 1983, John Biddy, African Religions and Philosophy. 1970, Albert Mosley, editor, African Philosophy, Selected Readings, 1995, H. Adira Orica, editor, Sage Philosophy, 1990, Tsneserekwa Burhan, editor. African Philosophy, The Essential Readings, 1991, Kwasi Wiredu, editor, A Companion to African Philosophy. 2004, and Richard Wright, editor, African Philosophy, An Introduction, 1984.
Who was John Rawls?
John Rawls, 1921 to 2002, was educated at Princeton University and taught at Princeton, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Cornell University, and Harvard University. He is credited with almost single-handedly reviving Anglo-American political philosophy in his A Theory of Justice, 1971. Relying on both Kantian morality and the basic principles of consent by those governed from social contract theory, Rawls outlined a model for a just society. His additional publications include Political Liberalism, 1993, The Law of Peoples, 1999, Collected Papers, 2000, and Essays in the History of Philosophy, 2001.
What needed to be reconciled between Karl Popper and Thomas Kuhn?
Karl Popper, 1902 to 1994, claimed that scientists ought to change their theories when they were falsified, and that the hallmark of a scientific theory was its ability to be falsified. Thomas Kuhn, 1922 to 1996, believed that, in fact, many accepted scientific theories had plenty of known, falsifying data. The problem was that Kuhn's account did not allow for progress in science. According to Popper's criterion of falsification, and that Popper's theory seemed to be unrealistic.
Teresa of Avila, a Renaissance figure?
St. Teresa of Avila's, 1515 to 1582, writings intimately recorded her spiritual development in a way that invited the reader to take the same path for him or herself. Unlike Saint Augustine, whose confessional focus was ultimately on God and the religious community, St. Teresa focused on the individual heart and soul. Teresa's use of sensory imagery and her comparison of advances in mysticism to courtship and love throughout her writings could probably not have been written during the medieval period. Neither could a distinctly female human voice have found such religious expression before the Renaissance.
How is philosophy related to other fields?
Philosophy is now a subject in the humanities within the college curriculum. Its primary purpose is to study and develop systematic habits of thought that will enable students to recognize and evaluate their own life choices and understand the society in which they live. Because so much of philosophy focuses on ideas, beliefs, and values, it is rather easily connected to literature and projects in contemporary cultural criticism and analysis in other fields. Toward the end of the 20th century, philosophers began to apply their work to other fields. For example, via medical ethics and business ethics. The relevance of philosophy also increased as philosophers added feminism, environmental issues, and questions about social justice to their curricula.
How did Nicolas Malebranche react to Descartes' mind-body problem?
Nicolas Malebranche denied that anything, either mental or physical, could cause, or be the effect of, anything else. His reasoning was that physical bodies were inert and passive, without any force within them that could cause anything or even sustain movement. Neither can mental things cause anything, because there is no necessary connection between any human act of will and any other event. Only God has an effective will in this sense. Therefore, all causal connections in nature are in reality the actions of God. Causal chains in nature are like two clocks that are 1 minute apart in time. There may be an appearance of the clock that is ahead in time causing the movements of the slower clock. But this is no more than an appearance.
Did Plato change his philosophical theory of forms?
In the Philebus, one of his later works, instead of equating the good life with contemplation of the forms, Plato acknowledges that pleasure seems to be an important component of what is good. He then explains how goodness consists of proportion, beauty, and truth, and argues that intelligence is better than pleasure because it is closer to those three. This was a new, more down-to-earth theory of the good life for Plato because it suggested that the best life for a human being was a life of enjoyment of what seemed to be real, rather than a life dedicated to contemplating the forms.
What was Plato's metaphysical theory of forms?
Plato's major contribution to philosophy was his metaphysical theory of forms. Plato's forms were divine objects, known by the mind through thought. The practice of such thought was believed to provide the best life. The forms, like the primary substance of the pre-Socratics, were responsible for all of the things experienced by human beings and for the very existence and qualities of human beings. Animals, natural objects, and man-made objects. Indeed, the entire world of existence was held to be made up of copies of the forms. Even ideas, such as beauty, truth, and justice, had forms. Although to Plato it was viewing the mind's representations of the forms, not the actual forms themselves, that mattered. The forms were unchanging, perfect, and divine. Everything that humans could think, perceive, or imagine, and the existing objects of thoughts and perceptions, were but imperfect copies of the forms.
What kind of a materialist was Ludwig Feuerbach?
Feuerbach was an historical materialist. He sought to bring out the implicit Hegelian assumption that truth, reality, and sensibility are identical. But Feuerbach thought that by locating reason and consciousness in the absolute, Friedrich Hegel, 1770–1831, had alienated man's essence from him. He asserted that only a sensible being is a real, true being, and that thought is the product of this human being, and not the other way around. God or the Absolute is no more than the appearance of ourselves to ourselves. The work of philosophy was to begin with man, in his situation. Man was neither mere matter nor consciousness alone.
Did Socrates really exist?
Socrates of Athens, 460 to 399 B. CE, was both a real historical person and the main character in Plato's dialogues. In both modes, he perfected the methods of the sophists in rhetoric, argument, and dialogue. But as a character in Plato's later dialogues he appears mainly as a mouthpiece for Plato's abstract philosophy. While there is some controversy about how much concerning Socrates, the philosopher, was invented by Plato, there is stable agreement about certain facts of his life. All agree that Socrates lived the principles he taught. The most famous being, the unexamined life is not worth living. Socrates' father, Sophroniscus, was a stonecutter from Alopic, and his mother, Phainaret, was a midwife. Socrates himself was fond of referring to his philosophical manner of discourse as a form of midwifery. In Plato's Meno, he uses this role to extract mathematical truths from a slave boy as proof of the presence of innate ideas in the soul, which are first acquired in a divine realm before birth. Sophroniscus was friends with Athenian general and statesman Aristides the Just, 530 to 468 BCE, which helped Socrates become connected throughout his life with the leadership class of Athens. He served ably and courageously as a hoplite, infantryman, in the Peloponnesian War. 431 to 404 BCE. When he became absorbed in philosophical activities, however, he became poor. Socrates' wife, Xanthippe, was depicted as a shrew in later writings about him, but he cared for his young sons and asked his friends to provide for their Socratic education after his death. Socrates was condemned to death for not believing in the gods the state believes in, and introducing different new divine powers, and also for corrupting the young. According to the indictments related in Plato's Apology and Xenophon's Apology, he died peacefully by his own hand, drinking a cup of hemlock in preference to the escape arranged by his friends, which would have resulted in a life of exile. He refused exile because it was dishonorable and because he had voluntarily lived in Athens and accepted its laws throughout his life. To desert his city so as to avoid death would be disloyal in his mind. Socrates said he did not fear death, because he knew nothing about it. If there were no afterlife, dying would be like falling asleep. And if there were an afterlife it would enable a higher stage of discourse, it would be heaven. Another interpretation is that Socrates did not have much to lose by dying, he was already an old man.
How did A. J. defeat Mike Tyson?
This is an oft-told story that those who knew Air said sounded exactly like him. When, at the age of 77, Air was a visiting professor at Bard College in 1987. He went to a party hosted by fashion designer Fernando Sanchez. Air noticed that the professional heavyweight boxer Mike Tyson was annoying model Naomi Campbell. Air told Tyson to back off, and Tyson responded, Do you know who the fuck I am? I'm the heavyweight champion of the world. Air shot back, and I am the former Wickham professor of logic. We are both preeminent in our field. I suggest that we talk about this like rational men. Air and Tyson did have a conversation, and Naomi Campbell, who was not yet famous, took advantage of this diversion to elude them both. What was AJ?
What was original in Jonathan Edwards' view of God?
Jonathan Edwards developed the idea that God loves and is delighted by himself and creates us and other creatures as part of this joy in himself. Edwards taught that God's love is disinterested and that he is supremely beautiful, infusing the entire world with his loveliness. By comparison, the beauty seen by mortals is secondary, an imperfect copy of what God sees.
What was meant by reason during the Enlightenment?
Reason was considered a universal capacity of all people that was brought to fruition by logic and the knowledge of science. It required people to abandon superstition and oppressive institutions, such as absolute monarchy and doctrinaire religion.
Have some philosophers criticized consequentialism?
Elizabeth Anscombe, 1910–2001, in a 1958 article, Modern Moral Philosophy, coined the term consequentialism when she criticized 20th-century versions of utilitarianism that did not distinguish between intended and unintended consequences. Anscombe argued that only intended consequences have moral value. Anscombe is also famous for her defense of Thomas Aquinas, c. 1225–1274, Doctrine of Double Effect, DDE. According to DDE, an action is morally permissible if it has known bad consequences, but it is not the intention or goal of the person performing the action to bring about those consequences. In Jesuit moral reasoning about performing craniotomies, operations to crush a baby's skull so that the baby can be extracted to save its mother's life, DDE has been used. If it is not the obstetrician's goal to kill the baby but merely to extract it, craniotomies are deemed permissible. Anscombe provided this example: say she meets her mortal enemy on a cliff. If her enemy falls off because she accidentally falls against him, she is blameless, even though the unintended effect of the enemy's death is welcome to her, after the fact. Others have criticized the ways in which consequentialism seems to ignore issues of justice in cases where an unjust act or even a human sacrifice might serve to maximize benefits for others.